Hey everybody, I'm Jamie Poisson, and we are going to start today's episode in Kananaskis in Alberta's Rocky Mountains, where the G7 wrapped yesterday with Trump splitting early to deal with the repercussions of Israel's strike on Iran. Stick around though, because later in the episode, I'll be speaking to longtime politics reporter Althea Raj about a bill that the federal Liberals are trying to push through real fast that is being met with a ton of criticism for being generally undemocratic, among other things. First, though, Aaron Wary is here with me. He has been covering this summit, so let's get right into it. Aaron, hey.
Hey, Jamie.
Always great to talk to you. So I do want to start with the escalating conflict in the Middle East. Trump, as I mentioned, left the summit early. He spent time Tuesday in the Situation Room. There is now growing evidence that the U.S. is considering more involvement in the conflict. For example, Trump is calling for Iran's unconditional surrender. He is talking about assassinating its leader, referring to Israel's war efforts as people are trying to flee Tehran after Israel and now Trump warned them to evacuate. And both Iran and Israel are continuing to hit each other with missiles and airstrikes. Obviously, this is a very precarious and dangerous situation. Broadly, how much did the Iran story loom over the summit?
I think loom is the right way to put it. I don't think that it dominated the conversation, at least from what we know of the conversation, I guess in part because, it precipitated Donald Trump going back to Washington rather abruptly last night. And so that may have kind of moved the discussion, both figuratively and literally to Washington. And we didn't get a ton of discussion, at least openly amongst the leaders, about what was happening there or what the options were or what the response should be. There was a bit of a back and forth, I guess, virtually, where French President Emmanuel Macron suggested that Donald Trump, was going back to Washington to help broker a ceasefire. And then Donald Trump responded, late at night, last night, suggesting that Emmanuel Macron didn't know what he was talking about and he wasn't looking for a ceasefire. But that was about the extent of the real kind of debate that we were able to see. The other part of it was that there was this dispute behind closed doors about the exact wording of a joint declaration by the leaders where, at least according to reports from the Washington Post and the Guardian, the other leaders wanted to go pretty far in terms of a ceasefire or in terms of de-escalation, and the U.S. didn't want to go that far. So it was sort of all around what was happening here, but it didn't become a summit about what was happening in the Middle East.
Yeah. You and I just watched Carney's end-of-day presser. He addressed a bunch of the other main issues to come out of the summit. So I guess let's go through some of them that way. Carney was asked about the meeting he held Tuesday with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. There was a lot of eyes on this because the relationship between our two countries has been strained, to say the least. Modi's government was accused by the Trudeau government of being connected to the assassination of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. And last week, even Global reported that actually a suspected Indian government agent had former NDP leader Jagmeet Singh under close surveillance. There was a lot of criticism of Modi even being invited of this bilateral meeting between the two leaders. And what did Carney have to say about it at the presser when he was asked about it?
Yeah, so Carney emphasized a couple things. One is, as chair of the G7, not just the Canadian Prime Minister in this context, he felt there was a reason to invite India. They have been invited to the last several summits.
Prime Minister Modi has attended every G7 since 2018. That is a reflection of the size of the Indian economy, the dynamism of the Indian economy, Indian technology.
And so I think that gave him a reason to invite Mr. Modi here. Then he kind of moved into the meeting itself and said, talked about the two leaders discussing, cooperation between law enforcement. He sort of on the specific cases of the violence, that the allegations of violence that we've heard, he didn't say a ton, but in a subsequent answer, he talked a bit more about this being kind of a foundational meeting.
As a necessary first step an exchange of views, frank, open exchange of views around law enforcement, transnational repression as two examples, an agreement to provide the necessary foundations to begin to rebuild a relationship based on mutual respect, sovereignty, trust.
So I think, in a way, Carney saw this as an opportunity to reset the relationship, not without some controversy, obviously. And I think what happens next is going to matter a lot, because that's kind of how this is going to be judged. Is does this meeting, in addition to sort of rebuilding the relationship, whatever that means, does it lead to some resolution of what are some, very serious
Yeah.
concerns about what's been happening here?
Before Trump left, he and Carney did spend some quality time together. They spent an hour talking on Monday, right? And just what came of that? What did Carney have to say about it just now when we were listening to him as well?
Yeah, so the kind of headline item out of that discussion, beyond the fact that it happened for as long as it seems to have had, an hour of the two of them discussing things, is a significant chunk of time at a summit like this. The major piece coming out of it was this suggestion that there's now sort of a 30-day deadline on negotiations for some kind of new trade or trade and security arrangement between the two countries. Coming out of that meeting, the Canadian ambassador to Washington, Kirsten Hillman, and Dominic LeBlanc, one of Mark Carney's senior cabinet ministers, both, said that there had been progress, that they were, told to sort of accelerate their discussions with the United States. Mark Carney made the point that
quite often in negotiations, having a form of deadline is helpful to concentrate the mind, and that can be the case here.
I think that's probably what the Canadian side is looking for.
Yeah.
Is, let's not drag this out. Let's get this resolved. I think the question, though, still is, what exactly kind of a resolution are we looking at here? Or is it going to end up being a kind of a framework to further an agreement down the road?
hmm
Is it actually going to result in the end of tariffs? I think those are the questions that still have to be answered.
And then I guess, like, what happens if they blow the deadline? Like, what happens
Yeah.
after that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to that point, like, there is some suggestion that, Mark Carney keeps being asked, when will there be retaliation for the latest round of tariffs? I think that's sort of the unspoken thing, is at some point he may have to go forward with retaliation, and maybe that's what happens after 30 days.
Carney also announced Tuesday big money for Ukraine, $4.3 billion, and also more Russian sanctions. It is clear, though, there was a divide between the U.S. and all the other countries on Ukraine. Carney himself has talked about a realignment of the world order because the U.S. is no longer essentially like a reliable partner. Was that supposed realignment on display during the summit? How so?
I think so, in bits and pieces. The most interesting thing Mark Carney said off the top of this summit, in his meeting with Donald Trump, was that
The G7 is nothing without U.S. leadership,
and I think, that statement may have been meant to flatter Donald Trump, but I do think it kind of goes to the question of what is the G7 at this point, when the United States is just so offside with the other six on so many issues. And you saw that with the conflict over the statement on Iran and Israel. You saw it in the agreement they did put out on wildfires, and wildfire response doesn't mention climate change. That is, I would guess, is a nod to the fact that the United States isn't exactly on side on that issue. And then on Ukraine, Canada continues, Mark Carney continues to be very enthusiastic in his support for Ukraine, but we know that the language on Ukraine, they couldn't get to real agreement on that. And, Mark Carney in the news conference afterwards, I think, was trying to sort of tamp down or obscure sort of some of the divisions that may have come up over the last couple of days. But he did so at one point finally concede that, yes,
there would be, if you want a nuance or if you want a sense, there would be things that some of us, Canada included, would say above and beyond what was said in the chair's summary. But these.
So I think there is this kind of push and pull of trying to find places where the the six countries on one side and the United States agree, but at the same time still kind of running into these conflicts.
Okay. As you talked about on the show last week, this was a kind of test of Carney in a way. He's just become prime minister, and now he was hosting this big summit broadly. How successful do you think it was, as far as summits go, I guess, and by extension, Carney?
I think it really depends on how you measure it. If the measuring stick was, can he get through these 2 days without a major falling out, without something like Charlevoix
Charlevoix?
happening again? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Poor Charlevoix has become so synonymous with that meaning. If that's the measure, if kind of maintaining a certain amount of decorum and agreement was the measuring stick, then I think Mark Carney comes away from this fairly satisfied. They did get agreement on certain things. Artificial intelligence, critical minerals. So they did seem to accomplish some things here, but there, I think, are still sort of those broader questions about where the G7 is headed, where the world order is headed, and so on. And I thought, maybe the most interesting thing after, Mark Carney's statement at the
Mm-hmm.
top about the G7 and the United States was at the end, when at the end of his news conference, he
Mm-hmm.
says, well,
I'm gonna close. I'm gonna make one final comment, if I may. Just this is an ad lib to the question you didn't ask. What was it like in the room?
and he talked about the value of just having those leaders around the table talking to each other, even when they disagreed.
And there's 9 people in the room, and they're the principals, they're the leaders, and there is a great amount of direct dialogue and discussion, very frank exchanges, very strategic exchanges, differences of opinion on a number of issues, but from an effort to find common solutions to some of these problems.
And I think that is something that I think maybe people who still value these summits and value keeping the United States in it are still kind of ready to fall back on, which is, it's still good to have everyone around a table talking, even if they disagree, even if they can't agree on everything, and even if they can't necessarily come out with the sort of 20,000 word communiques that they used to come out with and be aligned on foundational issues like climate change, that there's still value in something like this.
Yeah. He did really take a run at the end there of just trying to defend the whole thing. Okay, Aaron, thank you.
Anytime.
Okay, so now we are going to pivot back to Ottawa, where Parliament is speeding incredibly quickly through a new omnibus bill, C5. And the second part of this bill, the Building Canada Act, is generating a ton of controversy. It's about fast-tracking major infrastructure projects, but it's being slammed by critics as undemocratic and a danger to the environment and Indigenous rights. On Monday, Parliament also passed a motion to move it through more quickly than normal, meaning that it could pass by the end of the week. I'm going to discuss all of this today with Toronto Star National columnist Althea Raj, who has written 2 scathing pieces about C5. Her latest column says that it runs roughshod over democratic norms in this country. Althea, hey, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so this omnibus bill has 2 parts. The first part, the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act, it basically reduces, or its goal is to reduce interprovincial trade barriers. And I think it is safe to say that it's not particularly controversial. It's not why you and I are talking today. So what I want to spend the time with you on today is the second part of this bill, omnibus bill called the Building Canada Act. We're going to spend most of this conversation talking about why this act is facing so much criticism and why you personally have big concerns with it. But before we do that, I wonder if you could talk about the case for a bill that would fast track projects and why a lot of people might see something like that as necessary right now.
So I will say I actually do not know a single member of parliament who doesn't think that we should be building things faster in this country. I mean, that includes the Green Party leader, that includes the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, Stephen Guilbeault, the former environment minister. Everybody agrees that we should be building things faster. But the question is, how to go through the motions to get projects built faster. So there are some like large examples of projects that have been waiting like 15 years before being approved. That is not the norm, but there are certainly ways, and even the government's own advisory board on, or advisory committee rather, I should say, on impact assessments have recommended ways to kind of speed things up. So the point of the bill is to try to get big projects
Right.
done faster or approved faster.
So what is it that people don't like about how they're trying to do that? Like why are they doing kind of different things here than what you just suggested?
So what I suggested would basically require more time. And the government doesn't want to spend that time. So I will split the concerns up in this bill in two parts. The process that the bill is being rushed through the House of Commons and Parliament, and the substantive issues with the bill. The bill gives an insane amount of power back to cabinet and rest power in one designated cabinet minister. So that means the prime minister could choose to redesignate another cabinet minister. It's not a named cabinet minister in the legislation. What this bill says is based on a bunch of loose factors that the government could consider. So it doesn't even force the government to consider them. It can approve, it can list a project. And by listing a project, the project is approved. So let's say you want to build
Yeah.
the Northern Gateway pipeline. The government can say, we think this is in the national interest based on what we believe the national interest is, not necessarily defined, and we approve it. And then we're going to start thinking about all the reviews and assessments that need to get done. And so like the Minister of the Environment would come back after the assessments are done and tell this designated minister, let's say, for example, these are 219 conditions that we believe should be imposed on this project. And that designated minister could say, that's interesting.
I choose to ignore it.
I choose to ignore it. Yes, that designated minister is under no obligation to take any of the recommendations that are given to him. So just imagine the amount of lobbying and the potential for corruption when like one person can determine whether like a multi-billion-dollar project goes ahead.
You wrote also that the bill allows the government to essentially delete laws if it so chooses. Like,
Yeah,
what does that
exactly.
mean?
So that's the other part that could happen. Let's say the government is very worried about building, again, a potential project, like a new nuclear facility, and they're very concerned about the environmental assessments that would happen because of this project. This legislation gives them the ability to just delete laws from consideration. So right now in the annex, there's about 20 pieces of law that they have to consider and 7 different regulations. They could just decide, oh, well, we're worried about what this independent review might come up with, and so we're going to delete it. They could eliminate the tanker ban, for example. There is no process through this piece of legislation where the public will ever be able to convince the government to turn a project from a green light to a red light.
Already last week, we were hearing from Indigenous groups, environmental groups, legal experts, democracy advocates who all had big issues with this bill. But just break down for me some of what we've been hearing, maybe starting with Indigenous groups.
So this bill is going to be stuck in the courts. There is like no doubt about it, not just from environmental groups, but Indigenous groups. In the Canadian Charter, there's something called Section 35, which basically says the government has to consider, is obliged to respect treaties signed with Indigenous people. What's more is the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So we must respect the right to free, prior, and informed consent. Now you see the Chiefs of Ontario, for example, were protesting on Parliament Hill on Tuesday saying that that has not been respected, that there is nothing in this bill that ensures that their rights are respected.
To try to make that relationship work between this government and First Nations, that it's gone so many steps backwards, and that trust and that respect that we had worked so hard to build is pretty much gone.
The government talks about truth and reconciliation, has legislation around UNDRIP, talks about free, prior, informed consent, and the process being used by the federal government to introduce legislation and bring it forward, ratified, within less than 2 months is unacceptable. I can tell you that Canadians ought to be alarmed. Canadians ought to be concerned that their government...
Now, among the factors that the government may consider is that a project advances the interest of Indigenous people. If you talk to government ministers, they will tell you that this is intended to ensure that before a project gets the green light, that provinces who are impacted have said yes, and that Indigenous groups, the right holders to the land on which this potential project could get done, have said yes. But the legislation doesn't actually say that. And it doesn't say the interest voiced by whom, by Indigenous peoples or by the government. So, I mean, Indigenous groups have warned. They've basically told the government, we're going to sue you. Like, we don't like this piece of law. We don't think it respects our rights. And so that's obviously troublesome and doesn't seem to respond to the stated goal of the government, which is to make sure that there is certainty and that projects can get done faster because of that certainty.
So the other piece of this is that process part, right? How quickly this is all moving, Althea. The Liberals passed a closure motion on Monday to speed the study and debate of this bill and have a final vote on it by the end of the week. How unusual is this?
I've been on the Hill for more than 20 years. Wow. And I've never seen anything like this. Elizabeth May, the Green Party leader, came out and said she had never seen anything like this. I mean, because it gives cabinet the ability to just delete laws that it doesn't like, it is creating such a dangerous precedent that you would think that Parliament would want to sit longer with this legislation. The government gave notice on Friday that they were going to introduce time allocation. On Monday, they voted to fast track it. Right now, on Tuesday, there are 2 hours of debate for witnesses to come forward and testify, and all the amendments for the bill are expected on Wednesday before noon. So they will have reviewed a piece of legislation that fundamentally reshifts, like that gives power away from MPs and Parliament to cabinet on a variety of laws in ways that could impact the country profoundly. And they will have had 2 hours of witnesses who could influence the amendments that they want to bring to this bill. Then they will hold another sitting later in the evening on Wednesday to hear from more witnesses. But those amendments are already supposed to be filed. So, you know, a lot of people have asked, a lot of members of Parliament have asked the government, please, like, split this bill up into 2 parts so we can fast track the first part. And the government said no. We heard from the Bloc Québécois, the NDP, the Greens on Monday saying, please let us sit through the summer so that we can give this bill due diligence.
We are rushing legislation through Parliament under the auspices of an urgent threat, but we aren't willing to put Parliament to work for what, an additional week to get things right? The debate on amendments does not need to be rushed.
The idea that this bill will be done and dusted by Friday must be resisted, and as an effort to make sure the Prime Minister understands, we will sit through the summer. There is no objection that I've heard from any member of Parliament or any party to the idea that we need proper study. Witnesses can come forward in the summer. What is the rush to pass?
And, you know, as a reminder, MPs just came back to work in May because the Liberals prorogued Parliament. You know, they were not sitting in January, then they were off February, early March because Justin Trudeau and the Liberals resigned and the Liberals had a leadership race, and then Mark Carney called a snap election. So it's not MPs' fault that Parliament hasn't sat. So to rush through a bill that could have significant consequences on people's rights, on the water that we drink, on the air that we breathe, and the government says, no, they want this done before Canada Day, and the Conservatives have been critical of some parts of the bill. The Conservatives say they're concerned that while the Prime Minister talks about oil and gas, that they're not going to approve oil and gas pipelines because the decision to list a project lies with cabinet. It could just be clean projects, for
Right.
example.
But the Conservatives haven't necessarily been talking about some of these concerns that you brought up today.
No, I mean, in part because the Liberals are telling the Conservatives how to delete the environmental laws that they don't like the tanker ban that they don't like, Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act that they don't like. The Liberals have just told the Conservatives how to delete acts without people causing a fuss, without running through Parliament and creating new legislation to repeal them. You could just use this framework that the Liberals have presented. If this bill is supposed to sunset after 5 years, but that means that whoever is reelected gets to inherit this legal framework and can build upon it. This is such, in my view, a dangerous precedent that we are creating.
Althea, just before we go, I want to zoom out a little bit with you because less than 2 weeks ago, we had you on the show to talk about a different sweeping omnibus bill, the Strong Borders Act, that is supposed to address security at the border, but it also raised all sorts of concerns that it could trample privacy rights and civil liberties here. And so I'm just wondering, when you look at these two bills, maybe some other stuff that you're thinking about, I don't know, but do you see a broader pattern here? And what do they tell you about how this new government operates, maybe?
I have a lot of questions about the way these bills have been drafted. First of all, they're massive omnibus bills that often include things that have nothing to do with one another. These are, steps that the Liberals used to rail against when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister and introduced omnibus bills. I don't know if the public service prepared these bills believing that we were going to have a Pierre Poilievre conservative government, and that is why we have legislation that looks a lot like stuff the Conservatives were running on, or if this is just really what Mark Carney's Liberals wanted to introduce. Because, Bill C2 and Bill C5, and there's another bill, Bill C4, that includes, political parties excluding themselves from privacy rights, not obliging themselves to tell Canadians if they misuse their data. There's full
We
of
haven't
like
even
we haven't talked about that.
this.
There's
Yeah.
all these poison pills. You think whoa, this needs a lot more public scrutiny. If this is really the agenda they wanted to put forward, and they're just using this kind of honeymoon period with the public to pass through what would normally be really controversial pieces of legislation that affect the rights of a lot of people and potentially could affect the rights of many more people. It's quite something.
Okay, we could keep going, but I think that's a good place to leave it for today. Thank you for this.
No, thanks very much, Jamie.
All right, that is all for today. I'm Jamie Poisson. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you tomorrow.